Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We're going to conclude our commemoration of Black August this week. I want to recap what we have covered in the past month. Every episode of this show this month has started with some aspect of Black resistance, Black rebellion to settler colonialism, featuring discussions with Black scholars, organizers, activists. So we started our episode on August 6th with a discussion with Joe Taché, who's an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We talked about the history, like that sort of moment of Black August. We talked about the Panthers, etc. And so after that, we the week of the 13th, on the 13th rather, we discussed the sort of economic side of things. We titled the segment Economics of Evil, where we talked about the rise of mass incarceration in the 1970s leading to the 1980s, with Eugene Puryear, author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. After that, we had a discussion with Gerald Horne, the author, I think, of over 50 books at this point. He seems to write several books a year, and the incredible, prolific historian. And so we talked generally about sort of the history of Black resistance to settler colonialism and how that shaped world events. We are going to talk now about sort of the contemporary movement. It's gonna be a little bit more free form. We're just gonna generally talk about sort of like these sort of various issues of Black resistance, the Black liberation struggle, etc. And so I'm very happy to be joined once again by Jacquie Luqman, who is the co-editor-in-chief of Luqman Nation, as well as a co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. Thank you very much, Jacquie, for coming on once again.
Thank you so much, man. I don't know what to say about rounding up this series, but I have to go back and listen to the previous episodes because, man, those are all my favorite people.
Yeah, well, so many of them appear on your own show as well. Yeah, so I'm wondering, kind of, if you can just give us a rundown, like, sort of your own, just of your own work and of kind of like the approach you take to sort of studying these issues, kind of what you have, how you have engaged with Black August so far.
There's been a lot of political education on it, like recounting the history of Black August and trying to connect why it was created to the issues that we face today, which is not difficult. But, you know, there's so much about the history of Black August that is, I feel like, at like the root of the miseducation and indoctrination of Black people in particular. Just the fact that there is a very strong connection, or there's a very strong vein in Black August to prison abolition. A lot of it, you know, it is obviously focused on the life and the writings of George Jackson, who was incarcerated for allegedly stealing $70, and he was given a ridiculously long sentence when he was assassinated. I think by the time he was assassinated, he had served over 10 years of that sentence. I think it was close to 17 years. He was in solitary confinement for much of that time. This is over allegedly stealing $70 from a gas station. So, you know, just the inherent injustice in the criminal justice system is highlighted in George Jackson's story alone. But when you look at how few people know who George Jackson is outside of these circles, right? Outside of the people who listen to our platforms, how few people know who George Jackson is. And when they hear that he was incarcerated, then, you know, the bias comes in. And I'm talking about Black people. where we have to combat this stigmatization of incarcerated people that has been indoctrinated in us. So there's a lot of these conversations that I'm having with people about, why they should care about what people who are incarcerated are political prisoners, because that's absolutely what George Jackson and everyone who is behind bars in this carceral state, capitalist, imperialist system is. Because people, people who are incarcerated, it's always said, well, people have to pay their debt to society. But everyone who commits a so-called crime doesn't have to pay that debt being locked up behind prison walls, certainly not in isolation, and absolutely not in the inhumane conditions that exist in our prisons, in the prisons in this country today. So there's a whole lot of unpacking, not just who George Jackson is and why he was important, why his writings are still important to the issues we face today, but why the fact that he was incarcerated is important, and why political prisoners are a factor that we need to continue to focus on in our struggles today, and how we need to stop disconnecting ourselves from our incarcerated brothers and sisters just because they're behind the walls. So, that's been, a lot of the conversation that I've had around Black August, in addition to, connecting the international struggle that is going on to all of these issues. So it's almost like starting all over again from the beginning, right? You're like just retelling this huge, grand, massive story over and over again. And you're starting over again, from the beginning. And Black August is the launching point for the story this time. So it's been interesting. It's been exciting. But it's been a lot of work. But it was never supposed to not be a lot of work, I guess.
So I've started to read George Jackson's Blood in My Eye, and I have to say it's incredibly humbling, especially his analysis of fascism is incredibly humbling, because I'm thinking of all of the disadvantages that he had stacked against him. I think of what it would have been like to essentially be like a Black political prisoner in the late 1960s at the height of this state repression against the Black Panthers, and to be really studying like this history in order to like write this deeper analysis, to have as strong analysis of anyone in, a stronger analysis than anyone in academia has ever had, for sure. But to have this, to have this like incredible analysis, this incredible depth and breadth of like history, and to actively be studying that while incarcerated, I think shows like just how much we have to learn from political prisoners, not just in terms of like lived experience, but in terms of like what so many of them bring to the table intellectually, thinking also of like Leonard Peltier, Mumia Abu Jamal. So many others are really contributing to the conversations, but because we have this stigma around political prisoners, those voices are either not getting heard, or occasionally like you have people who are more focused on just that aspect of them being political prisoners and aren't listening to the messages, I think, that they're putting out.
When I think of, what you just said about George Jackson and people like him and Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu Jamal, Mumia Abu Jamal is still educating the masses from behind bars right now, even as he is continually being repressed inside the prison. They're actively trying to kill that man by denying him medical treatment that is critical to saving his life. And there are always, campaigns going on. The same with Leonard Peltier. There are always campaigns going on, where people who are connected with them who are trying to, get people to, sign petitions, call the warden, call the governor, to force them to give our people the medical treatment they need in prison, but they're still taking the time, doing the work, and making the effort to educate the masses on the outside about the conditions, not only that they face on the inside, but the conditions that we face on the outside that created the conditions that they're in. So, when I think about that, George Jackson was so young when he was incarcerated, and the same thing with Malcolm X. And so many other of our political prisoners, they could have gotten into the system and been thrown into solitary confinement and absolutely given up, because we know that system is not, it doesn't exist to rehabilitate people. It doesn't exist to create an environment where people can grow and, better themselves if that is what people believe it exists to do. It actually doesn't. The prison system in this country exists to punish people. And really it exists to perpetually punish people. That's why it's called the penal system. It is a system of punishment. And that's all it does. But instead, these people took this time of brutal repression and used it to fill themselves with the knowledge of, how does this system exist? How was it created? Who created it? Who benefits from it? And who is a victim of it? And took that opportunity, or took that knowledge that they ingested in a time of deep repression, and decided that it wasn't enough to keep it to themselves. They had to share it with people on the outside so they could understand what this system is. So, when I think about how tired I usually am, right, because of everything that I do outside of my regular job, on By Any Means Necessary, and the organizing work that I do. And I don't do a whole lot. I like being in support roles. I don't need to be out in front. There's plenty of work to be done where, there are people who need to be, printing out the schedules and editing the speeches and setting up the Zoom calls. People need to do those things. And I'm at the point in my life and age where I'm good doing that. I'm good letting the young lead this thing, but it's still a lot of work on top of that, and other commitments. We are active in our faith community, so we have commitments there. And I get overwhelmed and I think about, oh my God, how am I going to read another book? Oh God, how am I going to? But I cannot approach any of this with the proper political orientation unless I do read the material that our political prisoners provided for us who came before, and those who are still producing this educational material now, unless I do continue to immerse myself in the history. I need to be constantly checking my political orientation in the moment to make sure that as events unfold in real time, that I'm sticking with what the ancestors made clear about what this system is, so that I don't get duped by whatever the agents of this system do at this moment to kind of placate people and make people think that they've won some stuff. Because that is really, really easy. And we're seeing it happen right now. So, in order to help other people not fall for that trap, I've got to be well immersed. Not that I'm an expert, not that I know everything, not that I've read everything, but I need to be clear. I need to have a clear analysis of what is happening in real time, so that, I don't get duped, and that when I have the opportunity to speak to other people so that I can point the okie doke out to them too, because there's a lot of that going on where, like just for example, the defund the police push. And, a lot of city councils now are saying, well, yeah, we're going to defund our police. And people think mistakenly that they have pushed these city councils and police departments to a victory, but they're not asking key questions like, who is deciding how much of these budgets are being cut? Who's deciding where the money that's being cut is being allocated to? Who's receiving that money? Who's overseeing it? And, what's going to happen with the community? Is the community involved in any of these decisions? And people aren't asking those questions, but they don't know to ask these questions because they don't have the political information that has been provided to us by people like George Jackson, who have made it clear that you can't negotiate with this system. The system is always a few steps ahead of you and has more tricks up its sleeves than you realize. So we have to immerse ourselves in the study of these issues, of this history, like George Jackson did, and never tire from it. As tired as we are, because this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. These issues probably won't be solved, all of us, in our lifetime. Brianna, we're not gonna, as much as I would love to see it, we're not going to topple this capitalist imperialist system in the lifetime of the Luqmans, and we're 53 and 54 years old. But we can make some headway to get the next generation in the streets right now on the right path to addressing the actual issues to get us closer to it. And to me, that's what Black August is about. It is remembering the goal. It's studying and training and fasting, which I admit I'm not great at yet, but and not tiring in doing it, recommitting ourselves to those principles to remember the goal, which is the liberation of our people. And if George Jackson could focus on that while he was in solitary confinement for a decade almost, then certainly I can read a few books and reread a few books and learn a few new things myself in my own participation in the ongoing struggle, and not, be a baby about it and talk about how tired I am.
A common theme, I think, for all of these segments that I've done on it has been sort of drawing this parallel between these two moments of this what appeared to be a revolutionary crisis in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s, as the U.S. empire began to collapse, and this clear crisis of empire that's going on right now as first the U.S. empire has started to collapse globally with its lack of domination over, for instance, Syria, which then sort of cascaded to the U.S. better understanding how much China had essentially overtaken the U.S.'s containment strategy globally, so the U.S. has no real way to check China, and essentially this rise of a multipolar world for the first time. Even if these poles are of a kind of mixed class character, there's no such thing as like a perfect state, etc. The rise of a multipolar world with China, Russia, and smaller regional powers like Iran and Venezuela created a situation within the U.S. empire that it could no longer expand, because empires only survive as long as they're expanding. And so a lot of this crisis that people are seeing now is essentially this empire turning inward to reassert this, I guess you could call it totalitarian control, to reassert absolute might over its own captive, oppressed populations, its own prison house of nations, so to speak. And so like understanding the parallels between those two moments, because like the US was able to recover as an empire from its crisis of the 1960s. It did so through a carrot and a stick. It did so on the one hand by establishing essentially what we understand today as a nonprofit industrial complex, but you know, it also did through intense repression, which we're absolutely seeing parallels of sort of the Nixon Law and Order, tack on there in sort of the way Trump is approaching it. And so, I mean, just generally the way the Democrats are approaching it too. There's not much really to pick from. The Democrats and Republicans have the same end goals here for sure. I think that's important. Like you mentioned, like kind of making sure that people aren't led astray. Again, I'm a person of severe melanin deficiency. I don't speak I don't speak for like what a black movement should look like, but I do, having been in the nonprofit and like having worked like menial jobs within the nonprofit industrial complex, I do understand what a reform and a reformist movement leading toward nothing looks like. When you kind of reform something, you give that thing a chance to take another form. You don't want to reform a monstrous system and give it a chance to take another form that then represses you and oppresses you for the next 50 years. And so like I worry about some of those tendencies, but I'm wondering kind of what you've seen out of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a big push by the reformers to hijack this movement, and that's the danger, that not understanding what this system really is. That this system has always been a fascist system. It's always been oppressive. It's never, you know, all of the oppressions that have been committed in this system, not just against Black people, but against Indigenous people, against Latinx people, you know, certainly against transgender, gender nonconforming people, gay people, and the disabled. Somehow, you know, we always have to remember that the disabled are victims in this system too. And I think we're having to remember these things because we are learning kind of on the fly, maybe in the past, 20 years maybe, just how pervasive the oppression is, that there's a very small segment of people in this country that actually do benefit from the oppressions of everyone who's not like them. But, you know, so everything this system does is, it's intentional. None of it is like, oh, we didn't know that was going to happen. You know, like when politicians pass legislation, like take the Civil Rights Act, for example. And I always try to use this example because people always use the Civil Rights Act as this marker for how much progress we've made, you know, in this country in regard to race and Black movements. Since, you know, we're talking about that in particular. And I always point out the fact that the Civil Rights Act was challenged by almost every white politician in Congress since the day it was drafted. It was passed under duress. It had to be passed because people were in the streets tearing tearing things apart because of the oppression that was very intentional. And the way that and I can't even call them reformists because they were white supremacists in Congress, the way they maintained power, even through passing the Civil Rights Act, was by writing that legislation in such a way that nothing really changed in this society with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. What happened was public spaces got desegregated, right? You couldn't legally keep Black people from sitting at a lunch counter to have lunch. You couldn't legally keep Black kids from attending a public school just because they were Black. You know, you couldn't, at least on paper, refuse to sell a home to a Black family. That's, you know, with the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act that came soon after it. And allegedly, you couldn't keep Black people from voting just because they were Black, that came out of the Voting Rights Act. But really, those pieces of legislation were written in such a way that integrating public spaces and not denying access to public services was the only thing that really changed in a material, significant way. Because truly, as we can see, we still have the same problems that our grandparents now, and I'm talking about our grandparents, mine and Abdus's, parents and grandparents, because we're 53, that, when they were teenagers, they were in the streets protesting against, we're protesting the same problems. So those pieces of legislation could not possibly have made the transformative impact on this society that people think they did if we're still dealing with the same problems. This is what happens when you have a reformist answer to a systemic problem, and you don't actually create systemic change or real transformation with legislation, because you let the reformists write the legislation. So what they do is they don't really change anything. They just, throw some wind dressing on there and make things look good. And, they make a nice ceremony over it, and they still keep making their money. They still keep making their money off of the oppression of the same people. And as the oppression of those people grows and gets worse, then they pivot and start blaming those oppressed people for their own oppression, because they can always go back and point to, well, look, we passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, and you people can't get your stuff together, so it must be your fault. Not understanding that a piece of legislation as massive as the Civil Rights Act was actually not transformative. And that's the kind of sleight of hand that reform movements in this system produce. I always try to use that example because I always like to help people see how serious it is when you focus on reform and think that reform is good enough. It's not. We cannot reform the system of white supremacy, because it's still going to be a white supremacist system. We can't reform, you brought up imperialism. We can't reform imperialism.
We are joined for the entirety of this hour by Jacquie Luqman, who is the co-editor-in-chief, one of the co-editors-in-chief of Luqman Nation, as well as the co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. We are going to continue this conversation with Jacquie after a short break. And I just want to remind people that People's Republic is originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned for the second half of our episode in just a second. Welcome back to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We are continuing this conversation with Jacquie Luqman, and I'd like to pretty much pick it up right there on this conversation of reform versus revolution, or how do we tackle reform and revolution. I have a much more optimistic view of reform. I think it's absolutely great that Joe Biden came out and said that he wants to shoot protester. He wants to teach cops to shoot protesters in the leg rather than in the head. That's what we need, right? Like, I mean, that's the absolute pinnacle of reform. Jesus,
I mean, you can survive a shot to the leg. You can survive that.
Yeah, it makes me think of what they were doing in I think it was Chile, where they were the snipers with the Chilean government. I think it was pretty sure it was Chile. It may have been Colombia. But yeah, Chile, where so much of the structure of the Pinochet dictatorship is still in place in many ways, simply without Pinochet. The snipers there were shooting out the eyes of protesters and whatnot, and so like a large part of the movement,
and in Israel too, where they're doing the same thing right now, which is, and you've got the police across the country doing exactly what police in Israel and the IDF are doing, shooting people in the eye and shooting people in the leg to intentionally cripple them. But it's so much better than being shot in the head. So much better.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, that's the sort of absolute nonsense that even passes for reform. There's not even anyone putting sweeping legislation on the table. Here, where the show is based in Austin, the conversation has been narrowed down so much due to the influence of the nonprofit industrial complex that the defund the police option that we're told is the option to make a major structural change in the police. The defund the police option is we need to reduce the police budget by $100 million. And that sounds like a lot until you realize that the Austin police budget every year is over $400 million. So it's less than 25%. And we're told that's what defunding the police is. But I mean, for most agencies, taking 25% of the budget away for a bloated agency like the police, taking 25% of the budget away is not even going to make a dent in the way they operate. And that's sort of the not far left spectrum, but like within the Overton window, within the acceptable spectrum of things that the media here is saying is the demands of protesters. The media is insisting that protesters are demanding $100 million reduction in police budget, when having talked to a bunch of people on the street, nobody actually wants the $100 million. That's just what they've been told their best option is. People want more than that. People want an absolute, when somebody says defund the police, most of the people I've talked to actually just want the police gone. They want abolition of police. But I think one of the things we have to understand is like we should absolutely push for, it's important to sort of push for certain types of reforms. I think there are certain reforms that the struggle for the reform, if nothing else, the struggle over that reform can kind of shift people's consciousness in certain important ways to where people see that when they try and reform the police even just a bit, the police push back so much that it makes it useless. And like that experience can, I think, radicalize people in such a way to see what the police do and to help people get all the way to understand what the police function as. On the other hand, reforms can serve to sort of satiate people's desires and make people think, oh, the battle's won now. At this moment, I don't see that happening. I just see a lot more frustration. But it's entirely a possibility that sort of thing happens. And so like, to me, it's always about like sort of looking at what the important reforms can be that might lead people to understand the situation better, but then also educating people about the roots of something like policing. And so many people are struggling. Like we have such an anti-intellectual culture, and when we do have intellectuals, it's the bourgeois intellectuals. It's the people who are very well paid, the Chomskys and whatnot, whose analysis is just withered away. It's withered away with grant money, the way I look at it. And so there's not any sort of strong understanding even of what is the state. If you ask people, what is the state? Why does the state exist? Most people will not understand that. And it's like, that's, I think, the point of the struggle we're at right now is just getting people to understand, or helping people to understand, not like forcing it down their throats, but helping people to understand that like the state is the byproduct of class antagonisms. If you have multiple classes within a society, people who live off of one sort of labor or one relation to labor, one relation to commodities versus people who live on different labor. That is to say the bosses, the workers, the employers, the employees, or however you want to put that, the slave owners, the slaves, whatever class contradictions exist within that, they are managed by the state. And so the higher the contradictions are, that is to say, like the richer the rich are and the poor are, the more those contradictions are heightened, and the larger the state has to get in order to essentially repress the kind of rebellious nature of those who have nothing, of those who are pushed to the absolute limit. And so there are so many other kind of points that people need to understand as far as like how the state functions, what the sort of tactics and strategies of successful revolutionary moments are. Like there's so much more that kind of we have to, I think, really understand ourselves, but then like sort of bring to our analysis when we talk to people about this. And it's I think always a struggle for me, because like, again, there's that intellectual, that idea that like things can just be learned through activism, or things can just be learned through, through kind of lived experience or whatnot. But it takes both. It takes a lived experience for sure. The lived experience becomes part, I think, of the history and of the political theory. But then the political theory also has to be drawn from the other people's lived experiences, from the analyses of someone like Marx, who, Marx is always like considered a old dead white man, etc. But in fact, he lived through a revolutionary moment. He tried to fight through a revolution. That revolution, for various reasons, failed. And so he dedicated his life, the rest of his life, to trying to understand the roots of capitalism. That's why Marxism sort of prevails to this day, because of its clarity of analysis. And so like bringing all that together, not to focus too much on Marx, but just to understand that like that level of like really understanding what is the root of your problem. You have to understand that social, political, and economic theory, or else you're just going to wind up spinning your wheels, I think, endlessly with, quote unquote activism and whatnot. Anyway, that's kind of a long rant on my part.
No, I mean, I agree with, a lot of it. But I'm, sitting here and my silent partner, Mr. Luqman, reminded me of something that James Baldwin said that, and this is in relation to what you said about people understanding what the state is. I think people have a passive but very tangible understanding of what the state is by accident, because Baldwin said that people in this country understand where they are on the social hierarchy, on the class hierarchy, in relation to where the Negro is, right? So, and remember, Baldwin was writing in the 60s, so the terminology is different. But how is that any different from the way we operate in society today, where everything that is dysfunctional, criminal, amoral, and the very antithesis of what so-called America is basically poor Black people? And people find their worth in this society based on where they are in relation to how they're viewed compared to how the poorest Black people are viewed. The police are killing a lot of Black people, and that's true, but we don't have those problems in our neighborhoods because even though we're poor, we raise our kids right. Or, even though we're poor, we don't have our kids listening to that horrible hip hop, or, we have both fathers in the home. We have jobs, and it's based off of all of these stereotypes that the system created about Black people to make other people feel like, well, as long as I don't live like those folks over there, then I'm in a better position in this society than they are, and I want to keep it that way. I think that is true of most people. Most people get that, even though they don't understand that is that thinking, that is the function of the state. All of that, the stereotypes that are created, the oppression and the punitive treatment of the people that the stereotypes are about, the rewarding the people who believe the stereotypes with, even it's just a little extra attention from a politician who is lying to them just as much as he lies to everybody else, the social capital that people who traffic in those tropes enjoy, that they know that Black people don't enjoy, all of that is created by the state. And the state profits from all of it. So a part of this conversation is getting people to understand that something as basic as the way they have been thinking about other groups of people and the way they think about themselves in relation to those other groups of people is a function of the state. And they are upholding the state by continuing to buy into that social class contract based on that understanding. And they're supporting the state by continuing to treat other people in the way that the state says that they should. and to go along with their treatment by the state, the oppression that the state implements against other people. And for most Black people, we've always kind of known that the state is our enemy, right? We may have called them the man. We may have called the state the man for a long time. If you go back, and look at, some of our favorite blaxploitation movies, we do love those. That's kind of our favorite. For most of our experience in this country, Black people, certainly Indigenous people, certainly Latinx people, we know that the state is the problem. And I think that for a lot of Black people, the specter of celebrity has obscured that, where a lot of us now buy into this kind of, if I just work harder, I can make it and be accepted, in this society and not be treated so badly. And we have to deal with that now. But I think most oppressed people understand that it is the state that is our enemy. A lot of the education has to be done in this moment of the people who are coming out in alliance with us, who are protesting with us. All the white people in Portland who understand that something's wrong, but they don't understand how pervasive the wrong is. I think that's where a lot of the education it is happening and needs to continue happening in this moment.
I think that's absolutely an important distinction to make. And I guess, I'm like within my own circles, like I'm talking about like, especially kind of the liberal white people I know who definitely are developing an an understanding of a lot of this for the first time. And I think if there's anything that the U.S. is uniquely good at, if there's anything at which America is exceptional, other than like exceptionally high COVID rates right now, if there's any true exceptionality to the United States, it's that the United States is exceptionally good at turning people against their own class interests from the very root of this society, from the colonial period. It's essentially, and you can read this in so much of Gerald Horne's work, which I'd like to just briefly mention again, that Gerald Horne has done so much of the groundwork on really like laying bare how this happened. Certainly there's other work as well on sort of like the construction of whiteness. But sort of this bringing people into, again, like what's called whiteness, and sort of getting them, especially like the poor Europeans and whatnot, to side with the slave owning class, to side with the richest people in society against their other kind of the poor working Europeans, and then against, of course, African and indigenous peoples for the promise of some sort of stability. So like capitalism, even going back before then, even out of its development of feudalism, capitalism sort of was defined by sort of throwing people's lives up in the air, by destabilizing their lives, by making their housing and food situations insecure, and then providing them, or as to some degree, providing them with some opportunity, or providing at least a certain classes some opportunity to continue to survive, or to eke out some sort of like meager existence on the backs of other oppressed people. And so we see that within the United States. Another important book on this would be Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which really shows that it was like the poor and working and like sort of, I guess you could call lower middle class of these European settlers who were always on the front lines because their situation was the most insecure. They would always find themselves moving farther and conquering more indigenous territories to sort of maintain a class position. But what they were essentially doing is they were acting as shock troops for, again, the richest people of society, the slave owners, and later on the captains of industry. And essentially that remains unchallenged to this day in what we call gentrification. It's just that process back into urban areas where the kind of white people who are in danger of losing their class status are looking for, some like whatever semblance of security they can muster. And so like an important turning point is going, or I would hope would come. And again, like, I don't want to put like all the crux of like a revolutionary moment on like white people for sure, because it's always been like, black and brown people have always been like the vanguard of revolutionary activity. But it is an important tipping point, I think, when, Euro descendant people realize that we have nothing to gain from siding with an oppressor class, and continuing this farce that we can somehow continue to eke out a stable existence on the backs of people who are more oppressed than ourselves, who are truly more oppressed than ourselves. And, I think we're seeing that sort of moment, but we're also, again, like seeing the sort of, we're seeing these sort of grifters as well, this liberal reconception of whiteness, where it's just like, it's this constant sort of guilt around whiteness. It's this constant need to quote unquote reflect on whiteness, but doesn't actually lead people to any sort of revolutionary action of, okay, now you should side with black and brown people to fight for revolution. This kind of like constant white privilege discourse, I don't think ever has a plan for liberation, because they talk about everything in terms of privilege, and privilege has this contradiction of like, you can't really, like, privilege isn't a thing that can be extended to everybody. You wouldn't want white privilege to be extended to everybody, because white privilege means getting away with murder, but you don't want everyone to be unprivileged either. So it's like, you have to have a new conception, I think, of understanding that like this system is white supremacist. And sure, you can have been born with the advantages of whiteness, but instead of simply like spending your life reflecting on that and sure, everybody should do the work of like understanding their own biases. I'm still working on that a lot. But instead of this constant, like meaningless solipsistic reflection privilege discourse offers, instead, I feel like people need to take that an actual next step and say, I'm going to fight against white supremacy. I'm going to fight for black liberation. I'm going to fight for brown liberation.
Yeah, I mean, there's still, such an emphasis on, guilt and apologizing and, oh, we feel so bad that we've ignored this for so long. And all of these, it's like there's so many, white people, too many white people in this uprising right now, pretty much publicly flagellating themselves. Like, we don't need you to torture yourselves in order to be our allies. What we need is your voice and the social capital you have to get some things done. That's what needs to happen. And it's not going to be overnight. I mean, people also have to realize, allies and comrades and accomplices on the front lines, they have to realize that this is going to come at a cost that they may not have been prepared to pay, I think, because, when we went to a few protests here in DC, and we noticed that, a lot of the white kids were putting themselves, forming like a human chain in between the cops and the people who were trying to take down the statue of Andrew Jackson across from the White House in Lafayette Park. And, there was a lot of energy put into that, and that's great and that's fine. And, that's definitely what is needed in those kinds of moments. But then what was really interesting was after the police assaulted people, then you had, some of the same people, off to the side crying and hysterical and, just shocked that the police would, how could they do this? And, this is the same kind of thing we saw out of Portland, where the protests grew because people were so shocked that the police would be brutal toward, nice white soccer moms and pregnant ladies and, military veterans and dads with leaf blowers and, oppressed people are saying it's great that you are out here standing up against this oppression, this repression right now. But what we need you to do is stop being outraged and now become resolute and educate yourself politically on what it is you're fighting, because you're not just fighting this line of fascist cops. You are going up against the system that creates the fascist cops, that funds the cops, that equips the cops, that writes the laws to allow the cops to assault people and get away with it. They've been doing it to us for all this time. Now they're doing it to you. So yeah, we need people to be less to be involved in this less because they are responding to the outrage of the moment, which, I mean, that's great if that's why people are there. But now that you're here, now we need you to get well versed on what we need to be doing beyond the moment and where your place in that is. Because again, I mean, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And we're going to have to move beyond protest at some point, and we need to know what it is, what that is, that's beyond protest, and where we all fit in that, in this very long and protracted battle for liberation out of this system.
I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to sort of discuss, either about things you talked about or sort of other things you've been left out in the conversation. Of course, we're once again talking about the contemporary importance of Black August.
Since, you know, we love history so much and we love talking about the history of our struggle as a people and how that history connects to the struggle of other oppressed people and how it all connects to what we're facing and going through right now, Black August is so incredibly critical to that examination, of that history, because, you know, we can talk about dates and we can talk about events and incidents and people, we can talk about outcomes, but if we are not clear on the system that makes all of that happen, that continues to allow that history to march on unimpeded, unchanged, producing the same results and even producing worse and wider and deeper results, deeper oppression, deeper repression, to the point that now everyone can't ignore how much repression there is of certain people, because now everybody's getting a little taste of it while we're in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. So the facade of the system has been torn off, and this is a perfect moment for us to immerse ourselves in the principles of Black August, to study, to commit ourselves to studying what this system is, how we have been harmed by this system, how the system has been set up to do exactly what it's been doing and is doing right now, and how that knowledge can help us fight this system. There is no better time to recommit to those principles than this August for Black August right now.
What have you been sort of reading and studying, and what would you sort of recommend people look into?
So, of course, I've been, looking at Blood in My Eye and Soledad Brother, and listening to and reading everything that comes out of Mumia Abu Jamal's brain and heart. The writings of indigenous people I've been reading. I've been really enjoying Red Nation podcast, I have to tell you. I've been really, really enjoying that and learning a lot more about our indigenous relatives. I've also been reading, it's called We Will Shoot Back, Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement by Akinyele Omowale Umoja. I'm reading the speeches of Patrice Lumumba. We're revisiting the Communist Manifesto to get regrounded in the principles of socialism, which we absolutely believe in for our people. Definitely, we got Dr. Gerald Horne's new book. We're still reading the last book. We're hoping that he does not come out with another book this year, because we're not going to be able to finish the two. But we have really been just seriously gorging on the dawning of the apocalypse. That's just been so great. I went back and I'm reading The Condemnation of Blackness.
Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America.
Yes.
By Yeah, Khalil.
Yes.
Gibran Muhammad.
If you want to understand just how much the oppression, the criminalization of Black people is an intentional system, you need to understand it from the standpoint of economics, what it means economically to do that and where it started. And that is just a startling, eye-opening accounting of where the stereotypes and tropes of Black people and criminality that we talked about earlier, where they really come from and why.
You know, I have to say I have absolutely terrible news for you. When I was talking to Dr. Horn, I asked him about his new work, and he does indeed have a new book coming out this year. We were joined for this episode by Jacquie Luqman, who's the one of the co-editors-in-chief of Luqman Nation, as well as the co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. Thank you so much, Jacquie, for coming on once again. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, thanks so much. Always my pleasure.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.